Ilhan Omar looked straight across the hearing room at Marco Rubio and called him a delivery boy on national television. And she did it with the confidence of someone who believed the cameras were already on her side. It was not a careless insult tossed out in the heat of a messy argument, and it was not some accidental phrase that slipped past discipline before the mind could pull it back. It was loaded, aimed, polished, and delivered like a line built for clipping, a line designed to travel faster than the evidence waiting quietly on the table. She was not simply attacking Rubio's position, or his foreign policy record, or even his relationship with the donor class she wanted to put on trial before the country. She was reaching past the office, past the microphone, past the hearing itself, and grabbing at the immigrant story that had put him in that chair. Rubio was the son of Cuban refugees, the son of a mother who cleaned hotel rooms and a father who poured drinks behind a bar for men who rarely bothered to learn his name. That family history was not campaign decoration to him. Not a soft-focused paragraph in a biography, not a convenient piece of emotional branding pulled out only when the cameras were useful. It was the hard, unglamorous machinery of American upward mobility. The long hallway, the wet towels, the aching feet, the coins on the bar, the sacrifice that does not trend because it has no slogan attached to it. Omar understood exactly what she was touching when she brought his mother into the room, and that was what made the move so revealing. She dressed the insult as moral confidence, but beneath the posture was something smaller, sharper, and far more political. An attempt to reduce a man's whole life into a role assigned by her accusation. Before Rubio ever opened his folder, Omar had already tried to define the hearing for everyone watching. She sat upright, composed, precise, every gesture arranged with the discipline of someone who knew that posture can perform innocence before facts are even allowed to speak. Her hands were balanced near the microphone, her chin set at the clean angle of a person who understood television, and her words came wrapped in the familiar architecture of preemptive defense. This was not about prejudice, she suggested, but about silencing a Muslim woman who dared to criticize Israel, and in that single maneuver, she tried to turn scrutiny itself into an act of persecution. It was the old Washington trick with a sharper moral edge. Accuse the examiners before they examine, poison the question before it is asked, and make the record look guilty simply for existing. That is why her opening move mattered, because it was not a defense of facts, but a defense against facts. She did not begin by explaining the statements, the dates, the language, or the pattern that had followed her for years through interviews, apologies, defenses, and carefully managed outrage cycles. She began by building a shield large enough to cover every sentence she had ever written, and heavy enough to make anyone lifting it look like the aggressor. Then she turned directly toward Rubio and moved from accusation into biography, from policy into personal attack, from Israel and Palestine into the refugee story she wanted to own exclusively. She talked about camps, sickness, concrete floors, and rooms without doors, not merely to tell the room where she came from, but to claim moral altitude before dragging Rubio downward. Then came the line, the one meant to break the room open and hand the internet its favorite 3 seconds. "You are their delivery boy, Secretary Rubio," she said, and the phrase carried exactly the kind of cruelty that pretends to be courage when a friendly audience is waiting to applaud it. She did not stop there, because restraint would have weakened the theatrical point, and the theatrical point was the entire weapon. She said he carried the packages, rang the bell, collected the tip, and everyone in Washington knew it, as though repetition could turn insult into evidence. Then she reached for his mother, pretending to respect working women while using hotel labor as a political knife, and the ugliness of that choice changed the temperature in the room. The cameras found Rubio's face, because that was what Omar wanted them to find. Anger, humiliation, wounded pride, anything loud enough to cut into a clip and bury the record beneath emotion. But Rubio did not give her the explosion, and that refusal was the first serious crack in her strategy. His hands stayed flat on the table, his jaw held steady, and the folder beside him became louder than any shouted response could have been. 4 seconds passed, then 5, and the silence did more damage than outrage because it told everyone watching that Rubio was not choosing between insult and counter-insult. He was choosing the moment when the performance would end and the paper would begin. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than the room expected, and that made it more dangerous. He named what she had done without decorating it, saying she had called him a delivery boy on national television in front of his children who were watching. There was no theatrical tremble in the sentence, no plea for pity, no attempt to turn himself into the victim she was already prepared to accuse him of becoming. He simply placed the insult beside the image of a family watching from home, and suddenly the line Omar had delivered for applause looked less like bravery and more like calculation. Then he brought his mother back into the room, not as a prop for grievance, but as a witness Omar had tried to use and could no longer control. He described the Rooney Plaza in Miami Beach, the rooms cleaned, the beds made, the towels carried, the strangers who walked past without learning a name. He described his father behind the bar, serving men who reduced him to buddy, because even ordinary respect was apparently too expensive for them to spend. He said they came from Cuba with one suitcase between them, and they worked not for a lobby, not for a donor, not for a political action committee, but for their children. That was the first real turn of the hearing, because Rubio refused to let Omar's insult become the subject, while also refusing to let her cheapen the labor she had dragged into it. He took the personal attack, stripped it of its intended power, and placed it back on the table as evidence of her own judgment. Then he opened the folder, slowly enough for the room to understand that this was where the hearing actually began. The sound of paper became the sound of the trap closing, because Omar had prepared for outrage, prepared for accusation, prepared for a fight over tone, identity, power, and victimhood. What she had not prepared for was a sequence. Dates placed beside quotes, statements placed beside explanations, a record arranged so cleanly that emotion could not smear it fast enough. Rubio said the hearing was not about him and not about her, but about her words, under her name, in public, on the record. And then he took the phrase she had thrown at him and turned it against the entire performance. If she wanted to call him a delivery boy, then he was about to deliver something far heavier than an insult. But that folder did not only contain lines Omar had defended. It contained the beginning of a pattern, and once Rubio started reading, the room would discover that the most damaging sentence was not the one she shouted into the hearing, but the one she once decided to erase. Rubio turned to the first page, and the room understood immediately that he was not going to chase Omar into a shouting match over feelings, labels, or who had the cleaner moral costume under studio lighting. He read the date, February 10th, 2019, and then he read the words she had chosen when explaining why members of Congress supported Israel. It's all about the Benjamin's baby. That was the first sheet on the table, and by itself it could still be forced through the familiar Washington machine, sanded down into bad phrasing, reframed as criticism of a lobbying group, defended by allies who specialize in pretending obvious things are complicated. Omar reached for that answer quickly, saying she was criticizing AIPAC, not Jewish people, and insisting there was a difference between opposing a political lobby and expressing prejudice. It was a clean answer if nobody looked beyond it. But the problem with clean answers is that they only stay clean when the rest of the record remains hidden. Rubio did not argue with the first escape hatch, because he had not come to debate one isolated sentence as if it floated alone in the air, innocent of everything before and after it. He turned the page, went back to 2012, and read the line about Israel having hypnotized the world, a phrase that did not need theatrical emphasis because the language carried its own poison. Omar tried to move again, tried to say it was about military action in Gaza, tried to put policy clothing over words that sounded much older than the modern argument she wanted to hide inside. But Rubio kept the record moving because that was the one thing her defense could not survive. Movement from one statement to the next, from one explanation to another, until coincidence began to look like choreography. Then came the February 27th, 2019 statement about allegiance to a foreign country, and the room felt the pattern beginning to harden in real time. That phrase mattered because it reached into one of the oldest accusations in political life: the suspicion that Jewish Americans are not fully loyal to the country they live in, that their citizenship carries a hidden second command. Omar tried to frame it as criticism of an expectation, tried to make the subject sound institutional and abstract, but Rubio had already placed the 3 pages beside each other where abstraction could no longer protect them. Benjamins, hypnosis, allegiance, money, manipulation, dual loyalty, 3 different doors into the same dark hallway. This was where the hearing changed, because one statement can be called sloppy, 2 can be called unfortunate, but 3 across years start asking a question that no press secretary can answer cleanly. Rubio said it plainly, with no need for ornament, because the arrangement was doing the damage for him. 1 could be poor word choice, 2 could be coincidence, 3 was a pattern. And in Minneapolis, that word did not land like a slogan. It landed like a diagnosis. Rachel Abramson, 67 years old, sitting above a dry cleaner on Nicollet Avenue in the district Omar represented, heard pattern and felt the sentence move through a memory Washington would have preferred to keep local, quiet, and inconvenient. She owned a small alteration shop, the kind of ordinary neighborhood business that survives on trust, names, measurements, uniforms, prom dresses, and the small practical needs of people who still depend on someone else's careful hands. After Omar's money post in 2019, someone had spray painted a Star of David with a red line through it on Rachel's front window, and nobody needed to exaggerate that image because plain description was already ugly enough. The police report could record the vandalism, the solvent could clean the glass, and the neighborhood could walk past again, as if removal meant resolution, but Rachel still knew exactly where the paint had been. That is the part institutional politics always tries to blur, because careless public language does not stay in Washington, where consultants can spin it and cable panels can argue tone until the original words disappear. It travels downward, into neighborhoods, into windows, into shops, into the private anxiety of people who did not ask to become symbols in somebody else's performance. Rachel was not listening as a pundit, a partisan, a donor, or a professional outrage merchant who needed a clip to confirm what she already wanted to believe. She was listening as one of Omar's actual constituents, a Jewish woman whose representative had spent years explaining away language that sounded very different once you had watched a hate symbol dry on your own glass. So when Rubio placed those pages side by side, Rachel did not hear a political attack. She heard somebody finally refusing to let the separate incidents stay separate. Omar's face still tried to hold the same controlled shape it had carried into the room, but the old machinery was starting to slip because her defense depended on keeping every sentence isolated. Each line needed its own safe room, its own context, its own grievance shield, its own loyal chorus. Ready to say critics were acting in bad faith before the words themselves could be measured. Rubio denied her that luxury, not by shouting over her, not by moralizing harder, not by competing over suffering, but by doing something far more dangerous to a performance politician. He counted. He counted dates, counted statements, counted explanations, counted the distance between what she claimed each line meant and what the pattern looked like when the excuses stopped standing in front of it. And once the room saw that pattern, the next page in the folder became more dangerous than the first 3. Because it was not only about what Omar had said in public, it was about what she had once decided the public should never see. Then, Rubio moved to the March 23rd, 2019 line, and the air in the room changed because everyone understood this was no longer only about Israel, lobbying, money, or the familiar arguments people drag across television panels until the original issue becomes unrecognizable. This was about September 11th, about 2,977 Americans murdered on American soil, about a wound so deep in the national memory that even the laziest political phrasing around it sounds like disrespect, before anyone has to explain why. Omar knew that sentence was dangerous the moment Rubio reached for it, because it had always required the thickest possible layer of context to survive public hearing. She had described the aftermath of 9/11 by saying that some people did something, and then moved quickly into the effect on Muslim civil liberties, making the dead a subordinate clause inside a sentence whose real subject was political injury. Rubio did not need to raise his voice because the words were already exposed, and the more calmly he read them, the worse they sounded. Omar immediately reached for the defense she had used for years, that the quote had been taken out of context, that hostile critics had clipped it dishonestly, that the real point was the treatment of Muslim Americans after the attacks. But this time the old defense ran into a wall because Rubio was not holding a meme, not holding a headline, not holding a bad faith edit designed to flatten the entire speech into one ugly phrase. He had brought the full context, and that was the part her answer could not survive, because the full context did not rescue the sentence. It made clear exactly where the victims had been placed in her moral order. In her construction, the 2,977 people were not the center, not the subject, not the human weight of the sentence, but the incident that introduced the consequence she wanted to discuss. Rubio made that distinction with brutal control, saying that in the full context, September 11th became the subordinate clause, while Omar herself and her community's loss of civil liberties became the main event. That was not a small grammatical complaint, and everybody in that room knew it. Politics hides behind grammar when it wants to escape morality. But sometimes grammar is morality, because the subject of a sentence tells you who the speaker believes deserves the emotional center of the story. Rubio forced the room to look at that structure without decorative outrage, and that made Omar's interruption sound thinner than she needed it to sound. She tried to say she would not be lectured, tried to pull the conversation back into the familiar frame where she was the one under attack, and everyone else was abusing power by noticing her words. But Rubio undercut that move by going lower instead of louder, naming the dead not as some people, not as a political setup, not as a convenient historical marker, but as Americans with names, families, jobs, calls, last moments, and lives that did not exist to serve anybody's later narrative. He spoke of fathers who went to work and never returned, mothers who called from stairwells, firefighters moving upward while everyone else ran down, office workers trapped between smoke and windows, and passengers who realized in real time that the country was under attack. He did not make himself the tragedy, and that was exactly why the moment worked. He said he was 17 years old in a classroom in Miami when the second plane hit the South Tower, and the point was not that his memory mattered more than anyone else's, but that every American old enough to remember that morning still carries the shape of it somewhere. The classroom, the television, the silence. The girl next to him crying because she understood the world had broken. All of it stood in hard contrast to Omar's phrasing. She had compressed national trauma into something, and Rubio expanded it back into human beings. That was where he drew the line between biography and exemption. He did not deny Omar's refugee story, did not mock the camp, did not minimize the sickness, the concrete floor, the room without a door, or the fear that shaped her early life. But he refused to accept the idea that suffering gives a public official permanent permission to speak carelessly, accuse recklessly, then treat every objection as bigotry. There is a difference between memory and shield, between hardship and immunity, between a life story that explains a person's path and a political identity that gets deployed every time the record starts asking questions. Rubio's point was savage because it did not require him to say, Omar had no pain. It required him only to say that pain does not erase responsibility. Omar tried to recover by reaching for the phrase every politician uses when the evidence has become inconvenient. The people of my district. But that sentence had a problem sitting quietly hundreds of miles away in Minneapolis, above a dry cleaner on Nicollet Avenue, watching the same hearing with a shop window in her memory. Rachel Abramson was one of those people, one of Omar's constituents, one of the vulnerable she claimed to fight for, and Rachel had lived through the local consequence of national language dressed up as brave provocation. That is why the phrase began to collapse before Omar could finish using it. Because my district sounds powerful only when the people inside it remain abstract. Once one of them has a name, a window, a police report, and 6 years of exhaustion, the slogan stops working like cover and starts sounding like erasure. Then Omar reached again for taken out of context, and this time the phrase died in the open. Rubio had read the context, the dates, the sequence, the surrounding meaning, and the pattern, which meant the old escape route no longer led anywhere useful. Her chin dipped just enough for the cameras to catch the moment control moved across the table, and her hands disappeared from view, no longer arranged beside the microphone like part of the performance. For the first time, the identity shield did not deploy with its usual force, because the words on the table were hers, and you cannot call your own words prejudice against yourself. But the most damaging page was still waiting, because Rubio had not yet reached the sentence Omar once wrote honestly, then erased when honesty stopped being profitable. Rubio turned to the last page, and the room finally understood why the folder had been sitting there like a loaded object from the first minute Omar chose insult over explanation. This was not one more public statement she could reframe, not another old post she could bury under context, not another sharp phrase that allies could soften with the usual language about criticism, power, lobbying, and misunderstanding. It was the line she had deleted, the line that said Israel had a right to defend itself, that Palestinian loss of life was a tragedy, and that context mattered. That was what made the page devastating, because the deleted sentence was not the ugliest thing in the record. It was the most honest thing in the record. 3 statements she had kept because they fed the performance, and 1 statement she had erased because it complicated the brand. That was the real indictment sitting beneath Rubio's controlled delivery, sharper than any accusation he could have manufactured on his own. Omar had not merely said reckless things, defended them, wrapped them in grievance, and demanded that every objection be treated as persecution. She had also shown, through deletion, that she understood complexity before politics taught her that complexity was bad business. The honest sentence did not raise money, did not flatter the loudest crowd, did not harden the shield, did not turn every question into proof that she was being silenced. So it disappeared, and in its place survived the language of Benjamins, hypnosis, foreign allegiance, and some people did something, because anger was more useful than accuracy. That was when Omar's final answer arrived with the weight of a door closing from the inside. "I have nothing further to add," she said, and the sentence sounded less like restraint than retreat, less like dignity than the last available shelter after every larger defense had failed. The woman who had entered the room prepared to prosecute Rubio's motives now had her own choices laid out in sequence. And sequence is merciless when a politician's entire survival strategy depends on fragments. Her hands were no longer performing composure beside the microphone. The shield did not rise with its usual confidence, and the old machinery of outrage had stalled in front of her own pages. She had brought a personal insult, but Rubio had brought the archive, and the archive does not care how convincingly someone performs injury. The clip did what clips do. It escaped the room, lost its walls, gained captions, gained angles, gained slow-motion edits, and began moving through the country faster than any formal statement could chase it. At first, people called it the Delivery Boy Exchange, the Rubio folder clip, the Omar freeze, the 9/11 correction, because online culture always tries to name a moment before it understands what actually made the moment dangerous. But the insult burned hot for a day, then started to fade, because insults are built for impact, and impact is not the same thing as staying power. The words stayed longer because they were not about Rubio's wounded pride. They were about Omar's record, arranged so clearly that even friendly commentators had to work harder than usual to blur it. A personal attack can dominate a news cycle, but a record placed in the right order can dominate the story that comes after. That evening, Rachel Abramson turned off her television in Minneapolis, and the black screen did not erase the word that had followed her out of the hearing: pattern. She called her daughter Sarah in Chicago, not to explain what she had seen, because some conversations between Jewish mothers and daughters begin long before the phone rings. She said he had talked about the window, not by name, not directly, but close enough for both of them to understand exactly what had been acknowledged. There was silence on the line, the kind of silence that carries memory better than speech, because neither woman needed a lecture on what public language can awaken in private strangers. Rachel looked toward the same window that had once carried a Star of David crossed out in red, now clean to everyone else, and still marked in the only place that mattered. In Miami, Rubio called Jeanette and did not speak about the hearing like a consultant measuring fallout or a cable guest preparing a victory lap. He talked about his mother, about the Rooney Plaza, about towels, rooms, guests who said thank you without looking up, and the strange humiliation of hearing immigrant labor dragged into a room where it never belonged. His mother had come to America with almost nothing, worked through exhaustion without turning hardship into theater, and believed the country was still worth the ache in her feet. That was what Omar's insult had misunderstood completely. The labor was not shameful. The sacrifice was not small. And the woman who cleaned hotel rooms had not produced a delivery boy. She had produced a man who knew the difference between answering cruelty and exposing it. And somewhere else, Omar sat with the screenshots open, staring at the sentence she had once written before the political machinery around her had fully hardened. She had believed it when she wrote it, and that was why deleting it mattered more than any clumsy defense of intent ever could. The erased line proved choice, and choice is more revealing than accident, because it shows what a politician protects, what she monetizes, what she buries, and what she decides the crowd is not allowed to hear. By the next morning, her defenders tried everything: context, Islamophobia, lobbying, tone, Rubio's ambition, Israel, Palestine, campaign money, every adjacent subject that could pull the camera away from the table. But the pages were still there. 3 statements kept, 1 statement deleted, and the deleted one told the country what had been edited out of her public character. That is why the hearing survived the outrage cycle. Not because Rubio was untouchable, not because Washington had suddenly discovered honesty, not because one politician had defeated another in some clean moral contest, but because the mechanism was exposed in public. Omar entered with accusation before examination, identity before evidence, biography before accountability, and insult before record, expecting the old formula to work one more time. Rubio let the insult land, refused the emotional trap, opened the folder, and delivered dates, words, context, memory, and the one erased sentence that made the entire performance look less like courage than calculation. She called him a delivery boy, but what he delivered was the record, and the record did not need to shout.